Okay, let's dive right into what is honestly a fascinating paradox. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack how the world is racing toward an entirely new energy reality, right at the exact moment the United States is completely rewiring its own rulebook. We have this massive structural shift happening on a global scale, and an equally massive legislative shift happening domestically, and the collision between these two forces is just incredibly compelling. So I want you to keep this central question in the back of your mind as we go through the information today. What actually happens when the world's biggest energy boom collides with some of the strictest new laws? We're going to explore how global clean energy adoption is breaking absolute records, literally reshaping the way the world consumes power, while American legislation is aggressively pivoting to decouple from foreign supply chains and bolster domestic fossil fuels. It really is a tale of two very different trajectories. Section 1. Dawn of the Electricity Age. Let's start with the big picture. The International Energy Agency has officially declared that we are now living in the age of electricity. And if you look at the divergence here, it's pretty wild. Overall, global primary energy demand grew by a fairly modest 1.3% in 2025, but electricity demand, it surged at 3%. That is more than double the growth rate of total energy demand. So this isn't just about us using more power, it's a fundamental, qualitative reconfiguration of how modern economies actually function. We are shifting away from liquid fuels and combustion, straight toward electrified end uses. And we're hitting a massive milestone here. For the literal first time in history, a modern renewable energy source, solar photovoltaic technology, is leading the charge. It was the single largest contributor to global primary energy supply growth, meeting over a quarter of the world's new energy demand. Solar is completely crushing new build costs worldwide right now, consistently undercutting new and existing coal or gas generation, especially when you look across the Asia-Pacific region. But when we zoom out and look at the global data, we're seeing a massive superpower divergence taking place. While China is acting as a clean technology juggernaut, they built out 0.5 terawatt of renewables in a single year and curbed their coal-fired electricity generation. The United States experienced a really sharp resurgence in fossil fuel demand, driven by higher natural gas prices, winter grid stress, and shifting policy priorities. The U.S. actually saw a 10% surge in coal demand. It's a really stark contrast in national energy strategies. Section 2. A champion for the Earth. Before we get totally lost in the gigawatts, the tax credits, and the grid queues, I think it's important to remember the human element behind all of this. The recent passing of legendary actor and activist Robert Redford reminds us of the decades-long marathon to protect our ecosystem. And this wasn't just some new trend for him. He became a trustee for the Natural Resources Defense Council way back in the 1970s. In 1974, literally at the peak of his Hollywood fame, he was out there fighting against the construction of a huge coal-fired power plant in southern Utah. In the 80s, he founded the Institute for Resource Management to bring environmentalists and industrialists to the same table. And right up to recent years, he served as vice president of the nonprofit The Way of the Rain. The crucial point to take away here is that behind every policy, and honestly behind the staggering statistics of this new age of electricity, is a fundamental human desire to sustain the only home we have. It's a mission that champions like Redford dedicated their entire lives to, long before climate change was on the mainstream radar. All right, Section 3. The U.S. policy pivot. Let's bring it back to the United States and look at what is arguably the most profound shift in American energy legislation we've seen in years. We're talking about the recently signed One Big Beautiful Bill, or the OBBB Act. Signed into law on July 4, 2025, by the Trump administration, this legislation actively dismantles much of the previous administration's framework. It completely terminates the tech-neutral tax credits for wind and solar projects. It cancels consumer tax credits for EVs and home solar panels early. But it also opens up the clean energy sector to investments by publicly traded partnerships and provides emergency support to prevent the closure of coal and hydroelectric plants. The stated goal across the board here is to incentivize domestic manufacturing and bolster fossil fuel resilience. Because of this act, developers of massive, complex solar and wind projects are looking at an exceptionally tight window if they want to keep their critical funding. To survive the phase-out of these credits, they have to prove they've started construction by July 4, 2026, which is just 12 months after the bill signing, and they absolutely must place the facilities into service before the end of 2027. For massive infrastructure projects that usually require years just for permitting, this is a massive logistical sprint. Which brings us to Section 4, The foreign entity wall. But here's the thing, those tight construction deadlines, they aren't even the hardest part of the OBB Act. The real hurdle for developers is navigating the sheer scope of these new, very strict supply chain rules. Developers must now meticulously audit their entire operations for any ties whatsoever to a foreign entity of concern, or FEOC. We're talking about entities tied to China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. If a single FEOC owns just 25% of a project, or exercises effective control through things like IP licenses or long-term service agreements, the project's federal tax credits are immediately killed, gone. So, developers now have to navigate this complex material assistance math. If you look at these thresholds, it's pretty staggering. To prove their components aren't sourced from prohibited entities, a solar project in 2026 must prove that at least 50% of its direct costs come from non-FEOC sources. By 2029, that jumps all the way to 80%. And given that the vast majority of the current global solar supply chain runs straight through Asia, successfully sourcing these components domestically or from allied nations is going to be an incredibly complex and expensive puzzle to solve. Section 5. The Battery Storage Revolution. Now, despite all these formidable legislative hurdles in the US, the global tech march is continuing at just a blistering pace, especially when it comes to storing all that new electricity. Just look at this massive number. In a single year, the cost of stationary battery storage systems crashed by an astonishing 45%. It is now the fastest-growing power sector technology globally, adding a whopping 110 gigawatts of new capacity in 2025 alone. That 45% crash? It brought prices down to an absolutely incredible $70 per kilowatt hour. This new price floor is primarily being driven by massive manufacturing overcapacity in Asia, along with the industry's heavy shift toward cheap lithium iron phosphate, or LFP, battery chemistry. LFP is fantastic because it's perfect for frequent grid cycling. This cheap storage is literally a game changer for the grid. Think about it. In 2025, the world installed enough battery capacity to capture 14% of all new midday solar generation and shift it to the evening hours. It's actively smoothing out the dreaded duck curve of variable renewable power. And this is absolutely essential right now. Why? Because global data center electricity consumption, completely driven by the AI boom, grew by a massive 17% last year. They need reliable, round-the-clock power, and batteries are finally making that possible with renewables. Finally, Section 6, Gridlock and the Future. But here's the catch. Generating all this solar power and storing it in cheap batteries means absolutely nothing if we can't physically deliver it to people. Right now, over 2,500 gigawatts of approved clean power projects are sitting completely stuck. They are caught in grid connection queues worldwide. They're basically ready to be built or ready to generate power, but they are just waiting in line for the physical transmission infrastructure required to actually bring their output to the market. And this is quickly building into a major infrastructure crisis. Our transmission lines in the US and Europe are, largely 25 to 40 years old. They simply cannot handle the bidirectional flows and the concentrated loads of this new age of electricity. Because of these delays, we're actually seeing the emergence of what's being called a shadow grid. Major tech companies are bypassing the public grid entirely. They're buying up private nuclear-powered campuses and building proprietary microgrids just to guarantee their own power supply. Which leaves us with this final thought for the day. We clearly have the solar technology. We have the battery capital ready to deploy. But if we can't physically untangle our aging public grid, and if developers get bogged down navigating complex new trade wars and incredibly strict domestic sourcing laws, how long will the future take to arrive? Can we actually wire the age of electricity in time to meet this surging demand? That is the billion-dollar question. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it brought some real clarity to a truly complex global shift. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.